Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on hurdles to intervention. So in the last lecture, we saw how some make the argument that states have a responsibility to not be especially extractive and abusive toward their own people, and that if a state does not live up to that responsibility, then it is the obligation of the international community, strong states, powerful actors in the international community, to go ahead and intervene in those countries and remove those oppressive regimes from power. But as it turns out, we know that this doesn't actually happen that often. Interventions are few and far between, especially military interventions, and this lecture is going to explain why that's the case. Really, there are three main barriers to intervention. The first is a lack of power. In order to intervene in a country that is probably going to be very, very far away from you, you need to have an abundance of military resources, and more than just what you would need to be able to defend yourself. You need a surplus of military resources to spare. Very few states have those military resources to spare. They're expensive, so if you're having extra military resources to spare, why don't you just get rid of those military resources so you no longer have to pay for them? So really, when you're looking at the group of countries that have the military resources to spare and can adequately project power, you're looking at the United States mainly. Also, Great Britain and France and their former colonies, they have the ability and the resources to be able to go and intervene in those places. And then maybe, like Russia and China in places that are very close by, but not going to be on the other side of the world. So already we're looking at very few states that actually have the ability to intervene. And when you've narrowed it down from 200-something states to like five states that are actually capable of doing this, well, you're really setting up a huge barrier to begin with. And this is just the first problem. The second problem is that doing this is costly. If you have the power, if you have the ability, if you're like the United States and you could go and intervene, that doesn't mean you're going to intervene, because intervention is costly to you. You need to send out military troops to go do stuff, to go remove a powerful guy in a country from power, get rid of him, and try to start up another country or another regime with somebody else in power. We saw that the United States has done this a couple of times in the last 15 years, once in Afghanistan and once in Iraq, and it's not particularly easy to do this. And in fact, I went through the last few wars that the United States has fought, basically everything from World War II forward. And you can see that the United States has a big difference in the amount of casualties it's willing to suffer from, say, 1970 forward. So during World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam War, we see tens of thousands of lives lost. These are United States casualties, military casualties. And of course, World War II had a lot more. Those were hundreds of thousands of casualties. But then after the Vietnam War, after Vietnam War protests and so forth, we see that there's a huge drop-off in the amount of casualties that the United States citizens are willing to bear. So the Persian Gulf War only had 294 casualties, and actually 145 of those were by accident. An additional 35 of them were by friendly fire. So the United States was actually better at killing its own people in the Persian Gulf War than Iraq was. And going down the list, jumping ahead toward Afghanistan and Iraq, those are the most recent conflicts that the United States has been involved in, or at least the most recent major conflicts the United States has been involved in. And we see that we have under 5,000 casualties in both of those countries, or in both of those wars, and yet despite that, we are also seeing that there's strong opposition in the United States to continuing those fights, despite the fact that there are actually very few casualties involved. And we're actually at this point where the ideal war actually has zero casualties. We saw that in Kosovo and Libya, where it's basically aircraft and materiel that is getting destroyed and not people. I think that a big turning point here for the United States was Mogadishu. So if you've seen Black Hawk Down, this is immortalized in Black Hawk Down. The United States went on an operation to try to remove a warlord from power in Mogadishu. That's the capital of Somalia. And a couple of helicopters were shot down. What happened very quickly after that is some pilots died, and their bodies were dragged through the streets in front of cameramen. These cameramen took photos that got posted on CNN and were going through the 24-hour news cycle. Very quickly after that, President Bill Clinton, the president at the time, decided to withdraw the troops from Mogadishu. Essentially, there were people in the United States seeing that there were these pilots who were having their dead bodies being dragged across the streets of Mogadishu. And for the average American citizen, no one even knows where Mogadishu is or what it is or what the purpose is for the United States to be there. So in order to successfully intervene, you have to be willing to bear costs to do that. And as it turns out, at least the way it seems, people in the United States are unwilling to bear those sorts of costs for places that they don't actually know or care about. And then on top of all of that, on top of the issues with power, on top of the issues of having to bear the costs of conflict, you also have to know what's going on. Knowledge is very important in having a successful intervention. Now, there are generally two strategies to acquiring the knowledge that you need to go intervene. The first is a police patrol. The second is firefighting. So this is exactly how this works for your average everyday police officer or firefighter in your city. A police officer will go around on patrol looking at the regions of your city that they believe are most likely to have some sort of criminal activity going on. So this is active patrol. That's costly because that means you need to be paying someone to be going out there and going around. You're going to have to be paying a lot of people to do that to cover the amount of territory that you would like. This is in contrast to firefighting. Firefighters do not go on these police patrol kind of missions where they're just driving around the city waiting for a fire to happen and then going to that place. Or if they see the fire, then they'll stop the truck and then point their water cannons at the fire. That's not what they do. They sit in the station and they wait for a call. And once they get the call, they go and fight the fire wherever it is. So for international conflicts or international interventions, a police patrol is like having a bunch of military forces stationed all over the world so that if there is a fight or some sort of nasty thing that needs to be stopped in the United States or the international community needs to intervene in, that the police patrol, this military force, is going to be there to stop that. Now, this is very costly to do. In order to have an effective police patrol, you need to have lots and lots of soldiers and you need to be stationing them all over the world. That's not very easy to do. And so what ultimately happens is that we have to choose the firefighting method, where we sit and wait for some sort of bad thing to happen, and then once that bad thing happens, then you go and send out the people or the military forces that you need to stop that. But of course, firefighting has this big problem. If you think about the genocide in Rwanda, everyone talks about how terrible it was. And of course, it was very terrible. But if you look at what the United States could have done to stop the genocide in Rwanda, the answer is that the United States couldn't have done much. The United States could have stopped the number of deaths had there been a very active response. But the truth of the matter is, by the time the United States knew exactly how bad the violence was in Rwanda, there wasn't enough time for the United States to go and actually save a majority of those people from dying. This is the problem with firefighting, is that when you're being reactive like this, it takes time to get from point A to point B, and that might be a little bit too late for you to have a meaningful intervention. So this is why intervention is hard, and why, despite the fact that there might be a necessity or it might be necessary for states to go out and intervene more, or maybe in an ideal world that's what would happen, all of these barriers conspire to stop states from doing that. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'm going to talk more about commitment problems and intervention going forward through the next few lectures. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope to see you next time. Take care.